Dad, if they see you, it will ruin everything. Please go. My daughter's fingers tightened around my wrist just enough for me to feel the tremor she was trying to hide. And for a moment I thought I had misheard her because the words did not belong in a place like this. Not under the glow of polished glass doors and soft golden lights where valets opened car doors and guests stepped out in tailored tuxedos and silk gowns, as if the night itself had been designed for them. I stood there on the edge of the red carpet, my hand still holding the small envelope I had brought for her, feeling the weight of it shift in my palm as I looked at Claire, really looked at her, searching her face for the daughter who used to run toward me at the end of my workday with scraped knees and untied shoes. But all I saw now was someone carefully composed, her smile tight, her eyes flicking past me toward the entrance as if I were the risk, not the man who had raised her. I did not answer right away because I was still trying to understand how we had arrived. At a moment where my presence needed to be hidden, where I was something to be managed, and I followed her gaze to the reflection in the glass doors where I could see myself standing behind her, a gray suit that had seen more years than I cared to admit, shoes that were clean but worn at the edges, shoulders that carried the quiet history of every job I had taken and every sacrifice I had made. And in that reflection, I saw the contrast she was afraid of, not just between clothes or appearances, but between the life she was stepping into and the one she came from. It is just for tonight, she whispered again, softer this time, as if lowering her voice would make the request less sharp, less final, and I noticed how she did not say my name. Did not call me Dad the way she used to when she needed something, or when she wanted to remind me that I was still the center of her world. And I realized then that this was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision she had already made long before I arrived, a line drawn somewhere I had not been invited to see. A couple brushed past us toward the entrance, laughing quietly, their voices smooth and confident, and one of the ushers glanced in our direction with a polite but assessing look that lingered on me just a second longer than it should have, as if trying to place me, to decide whether I belonged inside or outside. And that was when I felt it clearly for the first time, not anger, not yet, but something colder, something precise, like a realization, settling into place piece by piece. I could have asked questions, could have demanded an explanation, could have stepped forward and forced the moment into the open where it would have to be acknowledged. But I did none of those things because I had spent too many years learning that the loudest reaction is often the weakest one. And instead, I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, watching the way Claire avoided my eyes, the way her grip loosened slightly, as if she were already letting me go. And in that quiet space, I understood that whatever this night was supposed to be for her, I was not part of it, not in the way I had believed. I shifted the envelope in my hand, feeling the edge press against my fingers, and I wondered briefly if she even remembered what it represented, what it had cost, or if it had already been folded into the background of her new life the same way I was being asked to fold myself out of it now. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out steady, almost calm, surprising even me as I said, "I see," because there was nothing else to say that would not make this moment smaller than it already was. And as I looked at her one last time, I realized that the night had not begun inside that building under the lights and the music. It had begun right here, in a whisper that told me exactly where I stood, and more importantly, where I no longer did. I nodded once and stepped back from her, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, just enough to remove the tension of her hand from my wrist, and for a brief second, she looked relieved, which told me more than anything else she could have said. So I turned slightly toward the entrance as if I were about to leave, but I did not move away just yet. I simply stood there long enough to observe, because I have learned that the truth of a situation reveals itself in the small details people think no one is watching. And the first thing I noticed was the check-in stand just inside the glass doors where a young man in a fitted black suit was scrolling through a tablet, greeting guests by name with the kind of polished efficiency that comes from repetition. And as each person stepped forward, their name appeared, their presence confirmed, their place secured, a system that did not make mistakes, a system that did not forget, which is why when I saw Claire's name appear clearly on that screen a few minutes later, followed by Ryan's, and then a line beneath it labeled +1 guest, something inside me settled into a colder, clearer shape, because I knew then that this was not about space or timing or any last-minute complication. This was about definition, about who I was allowed to be in her life tonight, and more importantly, who I was not. I shifted my weight slightly and let my eyes move across the crowd gathering near the entrance, men adjusting cufflinks, women smoothing the fabric of their dresses, laughter that sounded effortless and rehearsed at the same time. And then I saw Orion standing just beyond the doorway speaking with a man I recognized immediately from the photos Claire had shown me months ago, his father, tall, composed, the kind of presence that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And I watched as Ryan leaned in slightly, his expression tight with a kind of controlled urgency. And though I could not hear every word, I saw enough in the way his eyes flicked in my direction, in the subtle shift of his posture, to understand that I was already part of the conversation, just not in a way that involved my participation. A woman in a dark blue dress stepped closer to them, her hand resting lightly on Ryan's arm, and she followed his gaze until her eyes landed on me. And in that brief moment of silent assessment, I saw the calculation, not cruelty, not even open disapproval, just a quiet sorting of categories. And I knew exactly which one I had been placed in, because I have seen that look before in different rooms, in different contexts. Always the same unspoken question, does he belong here? And the answer forming just as quietly behind it. I felt the envelope in my hand again, the edge pressing into my palm, and I realized I had been holding it tighter than I intended. So I loosened my grip slightly, smoothing the corner with my thumb, and for a moment I considered walking inside anyway, forcing the issue into the open where it could not be ignored. But then I thought about Claire's face, the way her voice had lowered when she spoke to me, the way she had chosen her words carefully, not to protect me, but to protect something else, something she believed was more fragile than our relationship. And that was when I understood that stepping inside would not restore anything. It would only expose the distance that had already been created. I took a slow breath and let it out evenly, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral, because dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you carry, even when no one else recognizes it. And I turned my gaze back to the glass doors one last time, watching as another group of guests was welcomed inside, their names confirmed, their presence acknowledged. And I thought about how easily systems can define reality when no one questions them, how a simple line of text can decide who stands in the light and who remains just outside it. And I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate, the kind that comes when something long assumed reveals itself to be something else entirely. Behind me, a car pulled up to the curb, the soft hum of its engine barely noticeable under the murmur of conversation, and I stepped aside instinctively to give space, the movement natural, practiced, as if I had done it 1,000 times before, making room for others, adjusting, accommodating. But as I straightened again, I realized that this moment was different, not because of what was being asked of me, but because of what I was finally seeing clearly, and I glanced down at the envelope once more, then back toward the entrance where Claire had already disappeared inside, and I knew that whatever happened next would not be decided in that room behind the glass. It had already begun out here, in the quiet space where I had been asked to step aside, and where I had chosen, for now, to do exactly that, while something else, something far more consequential, continued to take shape just beneath the surface. I took a few steps away from the entrance, not hurried, not hesitant, just enough to place a few yards of distance between myself and the glass doors, and as I did, the noise of the arriving guests softened slightly behind me, replaced by the quieter sounds of the street, the low hum of passing cars, the muted conversation of a couple waiting near the curb. And I found a place beside a tall decorative planter where the light did not fall as directly, a place where I could still see the entrance clearly without being part of it. And I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, letting the situation settle fully into place, because there is a difference between realizing something and accepting it, and I needed that extra moment to move from one to the other. Inside, through the glass, I could see Claire now, her posture straight, her smile more relaxed as she greeted someone near the check-in stand. And for a brief second I noticed how easily she blended into that environment, how naturally she mirrored their tone, their gestures, their rhythm. And I wondered when she had learned to do that, when that version of her had become the one she chose to present first, because it was not the version that used to sit across from me at the kitchen table asking for advice. or laughing at something small and unimportant. It was something more refined, more controlled, something that fit perfectly within the expectations of the room she had stepped into. Ryan appeared beside her again, placing a hand lightly at the small of her back, guiding her toward a group forming near the center of the lobby, and I saw the way she leaned slightly into that gesture, not out of dependence, but out of alignment, as if she understood exactly where she needed to be and how she needed to be seen. And as they moved together, a man in a dark suit approached them, older, composed, his expression measured, and when he spoke, both of them shifted subtly, their attention sharpening, their posture adjusting, and I did not need to hear the words to understand the dynamic, because I have spent enough years in rooms where hierarchy does not need to be announced. It simply exists in the way people hold themselves, in the way they listen, in the way they defer. I folded the envelope once, carefully, along its natural crease, not to damage it, just to reduce its size in my hand, and I slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the motion deliberate, almost ceremonial, because that envelope did not belong in a place where I was not welcome, and more importantly, it did not belong in a context where its meaning had already been diminished. And as I did that, I felt something else settle inside me, not a decision exactly, but the beginning of one, the kind that forms quietly, without urgency, built from observation rather than reaction. A few feet away, the valet spoke into his radio, calling out for another vehicle, his voice calm and practiced, and I watched as a black sedan pulled up to the curb, the driver stepping out, opening the rear door for a couple who emerged with the ease of people accustomed to being expected. And as they passed by me, the man glanced briefly in my direction, his eyes moving over me in a quick, efficient scan, not unkind, not dismissive, just evaluative, the same way someone might glance at a detail that does not quite fit within a larger composition. And then he moved on, his attention returning to the entrance, to the space where things were happening, where presence was acknowledged. I shifted my stance slightly, adjusting the cuff of my sleeve, smoothing the fabric out of habit, and I thought about the last time Claire had asked me to come somewhere like this, how different it had felt then, how clear my place had been, and I traced the line from that memory to this moment, looking for the point where it had changed, where the balance had shifted from inclusion to exclusion, and I realized that it had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, subtle, a series of small adjustments that had gone unnoticed until they reached a point where the difference could no longer be ignored. Inside, someone laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried faintly through the glass, and I saw Claire turn toward it, her expression open, engaged, fully present in a way she had not been with me just minutes earlier, and that contrast, more than anything else, confirmed what I already knew. That this was not about timing or circumstance, it was about choice, about where she had decided to place me in the structure of her life, and I did not feel anger as I watched that realization take its final shape. I felt something steadier, something more precise, a kind of clarity that removes the need for immediate response and replaces it with something far more effective, patience. I reached into my jacket briefly, touching the envelope through the fabric, not to take it out, just to confirm its presence, its reality, and then I let my hand fall back to my side, my gaze returning to the entrance one last time before I turned slightly away from it. Not fully, just enough to change my perspective, because I understood now that what mattered was no longer inside that building. It was what I chose to do next, and that choice, unlike everything else that had happened tonight, was still entirely mine. I remained where I was for another minute, long enough for the rhythm of the evening to fully reveal itself, long enough to confirm that nothing about what had just happened was temporary or accidental. And then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not yet, but to check the time, 6:42 p.m., a small detail, but one I have learned to respect because timing, more than emotion, determines outcomes. And as I stood there, I remembered another evening, not nearly as polished as this one, when Claire had sat across from me at a worn wooden table in my kitchen, papers spread out between us, her voice uncertain but hopeful as she talked about the house she wanted to buy, the one she said would be her fresh start, her foundation, and I remembered how she had looked at me then, not past me, not around me, but directly at me, asking what I thought, asking if it was possible, and I remembered the way I had leaned back in my chair, taking a moment before answering, not because I doubted her, but because I understood what she was really asking, not just about the house, but about whether she could build something stable in a world that had not always been kind to her. I could still see the paperwork, the numbers written clearly in black ink, the down payment circled twice, $180,000, a figure that did not come easily, not from where I came from, not from the years I had spent building things slowly, carefully, making sure every decision held. And I remembered the silence that followed when she realized what that number meant, when she understood that it was more than just money. It was a transfer of trust, of belief, of responsibility. And I remembered exactly what I had said to her, not loud, not dramatic, just clear. This is not a gift, Claire. This is a foundation. And foundations come with expectations. And she had nodded then, quickly, almost too quickly, promising things that sounded right in the moment, things about family, about staying connected, about making sure I would always have a place there, not just physically, but as part of her life, part of her decisions, part of her future. I let out a slow breath and looked back toward the glass doors again, watching as the lobby filled, as the evening progressed without hesitation, as if nothing had been disrupted, as if the absence of one person changed nothing about the structure of the event. And that was when I understood something even more clearly than before. It was not just that I had been excluded, it was that my role had been redefined without my agreement, quietly, efficiently, the same way a line can be edited in a document without altering the overall format. And I considered that carefully, because that kind of change, once made, does not reverse itself on its own. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and adjusted my jacket, my movement steady, controlled, and I took one step away from the entrance, then another. Not as an act of retreat, but as a repositioning, because distance provides perspective, and perspective allows for decisions that are not clouded by immediate reaction. And as I walked toward the edge of the driveway where the streetlights cast a softer glow, I felt that same clarity settle deeper, aligning memory with present reality, aligning past agreements with current behavior. And I realized that there was no need for confrontation tonight, no need to force a conversation that had already been answered through action, because what mattered was not what Claire had said, it was what she had done, what she had allowed, and more importantly, what she had chosen not to correct. A car passed slowly by, its headlights sweeping briefly across the pavement, and in that momentary light I caught my reflection again in the side window of a parked vehicle, the same gray suit, the same steady posture. But something had shifted behind the eyes, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that changes how you move forward. And I reached into my jacket once more, not to retrieve the envelope this time, but to feel the outline of it, to confirm its presence as more than just paper, as a symbol of an agreement that had not been honored. And I nodded to myself once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, because I knew then that whatever happened next would not be driven by emotion or impulse. It would be guided by something far more reliable, the terms that had been set, the conditions that had been accepted, and the simple, unavoidable fact that when those conditions are no longer met, adjustments must be made, not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. And as I turned away from the building completely this time, stepping toward the quieter stretch of sidewalk where the noise of the event faded into the background, I understood that the evening had already given me everything I needed, not in the way I had expected, but in a way that was far more useful, because clarity, once achieved, does not ask for permission to act. It simply waits for the right moment. And I had just begun to recognize exactly what that moment would require. The sidewalk felt different once. I had fully stepped away from the building, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was no longer orienting myself toward it, no longer measuring my place against what was happening inside. And that shift, small as it might seem, carried a kind of quiet finality that I did not need to announce to anyone but myself. I walked slowly toward the corner where the street curved slightly, where the valet lights faded and the polished atmosphere gave way to something more ordinary. And as I moved, I began to sort through the details in my mind with the same careful attention I had always given to contracts, to agreements, to anything that involved long-term consequences, because what had happened tonight was not emotional in its structure. It was procedural, a deviation from terms that had been clearly understood at one point, even if they were no longer being acknowledged. I reached the edge of the block and paused near a bench that sat beneath a dim street lamp, the kind of place people rarely notice unless they need it, and I took a seat, resting my hands lightly on my knees, my posture still straight, still composed, because habit does not dissolve just because circumstances shift, and I allowed myself to revisit the specifics, not the feeling, but the facts, the signed documents, the transfer records, the language that had been carefully written and reviewed, because I have never believed in vague arrangements when something substantial is involved, and $180,000 is not vague. It is precise, it is documented, it is tied to conditions that were not suggestions but requirements. I could see the closing statement in my mind as clearly as if it were laid out in front of me again, the line that identified the contribution as conditional equity support, not a gift, not a loan in the traditional sense, but something that existed in a structured space between the two, defined by terms that included continued familial access, acknowledgement of contribution, and residency consideration under specified circumstances, language that had seemed almost unnecessary at the time, because Claire had looked at me across that same kitchen table with such certainty, such assurance that we were aligned, that the document had felt more like a formality than a safeguard. And yet here I was, sitting alone under a street lamp while she stood inside a building where my presence had been quietly removed from the equation. A car drove past slowly, its headlights sweeping across the pavement before disappearing down the block, and I remained still, letting the silence return. Because silence, when used correctly, allows things to settle into their true shape. And what I saw now was not a single moment of discomfort or a misunderstanding that needed to be corrected. It was a pattern that had reached its natural conclusion, a point where the original terms no longer matched the current reality. And when that happens, adjustments are not only justified, they are necessary. I reached into my jacket and took out my phone again, holding it loosely in my hand, not rushing to act, because timing still mattered, and I scrolled briefly through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Not a friend, not a relative, but someone who understood the difference between intention and enforcement, someone who did not operate on emotion but on structure, and I hovered over the number for a moment, considering not whether I should call, but when, because once a process like this begins, it does not reverse itself easily. And I have never believed in starting something unless I am prepared to see it through. I lowered the phone slightly and looked back in the direction of the building, though I could no longer see the entrance from where I sat, only the faint glow of its lights reflecting against the night sky. And I thought about Claire again, not as she was inside that room, but as she had been when she first asked for my help, when her voice carried both hope and uncertainty, when she had trusted me enough to involve me in something that mattered. And I allowed myself that memory not as a source of hesitation, but as a confirmation of what had changed, because it is not the past that determines action, it is the contrast between the past and the present, and that contrast, tonight, had been made unmistakably clear. I exhaled slowly and brought the phone back up, my thumb resting against the screen as I made the decision not out of frustration, not out of disappointment, but out of alignment with the terms that had been set from the beginning. And I pressed the call button, holding the device to my ear as the line began to ring, the sound steady, measured, each tone marking the transition from observation to action. And as I waited for the call to connect, I did not feel any urgency or doubt, only a calm, deliberate certainty that what I was about to set in motion was not a reaction to a single evening, but a response to a fundamental shift that had already taken place, one that could no longer be ignored or left unaddressed. The line connected on the third ring, a quiet click followed by a familiar voice that carried the same steady professionalism I had relied on for years, and I did not waste time with pleasantries because this was not a social call. This was a procedural one. "This is Thomas," I said, my tone even, controlled, the kind that does not invite interpretation, only acknowledgement. And there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded, recognizing the shift immediately. "I understand," he said, not asking what this was about, because he did not need to. People in his position learn to read intent from silence as much as from words, and I let a second pass before continuing, not because I was uncertain, but because I was aligning each word with exactly what needed to happen next. "I need you to review the Whitaker file, the residential equity support agreement, the one tied to the Maple Ridge property, I said, and I could almost hear the soft movement of papers or the tapping of keys as he pulled the document up, his voice returning a moment later, precise, ready. I have it in front of me. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I leaned back slightly on the bench, my gaze fixed on the quiet stretch of street ahead, and I spoke the next sentence with the same clarity I had used the day we signed those papers. Initiate Clause 3. And there was another pause, not hesitation, but verification, because Clause 3 was not a minor adjustment. It was the mechanism designed for exactly this type of situation, the point where conditions were no longer met and the structure required correction. You are confirming that the conditions have been materially breached, he said, not as a question of doubt, but as a formal step, and I answered without raising my voice, without adding explanation, yes, because everything that needed to justify that decision had already occurred. He exhaled quietly on the other end, a sound that carried both understanding and the weight of what would follow. Then we will proceed with immediate review and enforcement, he said, and I nodded slightly, though he could not see it, because the acknowledgement was more for me than for him. Begin with notification to the lender and the title office, I added, my tone still measured. I want the position clarified before any further transactions are finalized. And he responded in the same steady cadence. Understood, we will flag the equity position and suspend any pending confirmations until the review is complete. And that was exactly what I expected. No drama, no escalation, just a series of actions set into motion that would unfold with their own internal logic. I ended the call with a simple, keep me informed, and lowered the phone from my ear, letting it rest in my hand for a moment before slipping it back into my jacket. And as I did, I felt no surge of emotion, no immediate sense of consequence, just the quiet certainty that something had shifted from potential to execution, that a line had been crossed not in anger, but in alignment with the terms that had always existed. I sat there for another minute, listening to the distant sounds of the city, the occasional car passing, the faint murmur of voices carried from farther down the block, and I allowed myself to consider what was happening inside that building now. Not in detail, not imagining conversations or reactions, but understanding the structure of the evening, the sequence of events, the assumptions being made about the future, and I knew that none of those assumptions accounted for what had just been set in motion, because they were built on a version of reality that no longer held. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my jacket slightly, a small, habitual gesture, and I stood from the bench with the same steady motion I had used all my life. Not rushed, not hesitant, and I took a few steps forward along the sidewalk, not toward the building, but away from it, because there was nothing left for me there tonight, nothing that required my presence or my attention. And as I walked, I felt that same clarity remain intact, unshaken by distance or time, because clarity, once earned, does not fade easily. A light breeze moved through the street, carrying with it the faint scent of something from a nearby restaurant, ordinary, familiar, and I found that grounding in a way that felt almost deliberate, a reminder that life continues in its simple forms regardless of what shifts in more structured environments. And I placed my hands lightly in my pockets as I continued walking, my posture straight, my pace unhurried, because there was no need to accelerate what had already begun, no need to force outcomes that would arrive on their own. Behind me, the glow of the building receded slightly as I moved farther down the block, its presence diminishing not because it had changed, but because I had, and I understood then that what mattered was not the distance itself, but the direction, the decision to move forward without needing to look back, without needing to confirm anything further, because everything that required confirmation had already been made clear. And as I reached the corner and paused briefly before crossing the street, I allowed myself one final acknowledgement of the moment, not as an ending, but as a transition, the point where observation gives way to consequence, and consequence begins to take shape in ways that do not need to be announced to be effective, only allowed to unfold. The streetlight at the corner flickered once as I stepped off the curb, a brief, almost imperceptible disruption in an otherwise steady glow, and I crossed without rushing, my shoes making a soft, measured sound against the pavement, the kind of rhythm that comes from years of moving with purpose rather than haste. And as I reached the opposite side, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention. Instead, I continued along the sidewalk where the buildings were quieter, less curated, their windows reflecting a version of the night that felt more honest, less constructed, and I allowed my thoughts to settle into a deeper layer, beyond the immediate sequence of events, into the underlying pattern that had led to this point, because moments like tonight do not exist in isolation. They are the result of accumulated decisions, small allowances, gradual shifts that only become visible when they converge into something undeniable. I passed a storefront with its lights dimmed, a reflection of myself moving steadily through the glass. And for a second I slowed, not to admire or critique, but to observe, to confirm that the person I saw there was still aligned with the standards I had always held, the same posture, the same restraint, the same refusal to let external perception dictate internal value. And I continued walking, my hands still in my pockets, the envelope resting against my chest like a quiet reminder, not of loss, but of structure, of something defined and documented that existed independently of anyone's opinion. A few blocks ahead, a small diner remained open, its neon sign casting a soft red glow onto the sidewalk, and I paused outside for a moment, watching the movement inside. A waitress refilling coffee cups, a man at the counter reading something on his phone, ordinary scenes that required no validation, no invitation, just presence. And I realized how different that felt from the orchestrated environment I had just left, where every interaction seemed to depend on recognition, on being acknowledged by the right people in the right way. And I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming lightly, a simple sound that did not carry expectation, only notice. I took a seat at the counter, not because I was hungry, but because I understood the value of stillness after movement, of allowing space for the next phase to begin without interruption. And the waitress approached with a small smile, placing a glass of water in front of me without asking questions, a gesture so ordinary it felt almost deliberate in its contrast to the evening I had just experienced. And I nodded in thanks, my voice calm as I ordered a black coffee, something familiar, something consistent. And as she walked away, I rested my hands on the counter, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding, real, not polished for appearance, but worn by use. I took out my phone again, not to make another call, but to check for messages, and there were none, which was expected, because the process I had initiated does not produce immediate reactions. It unfolds through channels that operate on their own timelines. And I set the phone down beside my cup as the coffee arrived, steam rising in a slow, steady line, and I wrapped my hand around it, feeling the warmth, letting it anchor me in the present moment while something larger continued to move forward beyond my immediate view. I thought about the structure of what had been set in motion, the notifications that would be sent, the reviews that would be triggered, the quiet but firm adjustments that would begin to surface, not dramatically, not all at once, but in ways that would be impossible to ignore once they reached the right points. And I understood that the most effective changes are not the ones that announce themselves loudly, but the ones that alter the foundation beneath existing assumptions, leaving everything above them to respond accordingly. I took a slow sip of the coffee, its bitterness familiar, steady, and I allowed myself one final reflection on the evening, not to revisit what had been said or done, but to acknowledge what had been revealed, because clarity is not something you argue with. It is something you recognize and then act upon. And I had done exactly that, without raising my voice, without stepping into a room where I was not wanted, without forcing a place that had already been withdrawn. The bell above the door chimed again as someone else entered, the sound blending into the quiet rhythm of the diner. And I remained where I was, not waiting, not anticipating, just present, because the next developments would not require my immediate involvement. They would arrive when they were ready, shaped by the same structure that had guided every decision I had made up to this point. And as I set the cup back down on the counter, I understood that what had begun tonight would not end quickly, and it was not meant to, because anything built on a foundation as significant as this one does not shift all at once. It adjusts piece by piece, each change reinforcing the next, until the entire structure reflects a new reality that no one can pretend not to see. The coffee had cooled slightly by the time I set the cup down again, not cold, but no longer carrying the sharp edge it had when it was first poured, and I noticed that detail because it mirrored something else that had shifted, not the clarity of what I had done, but the immediacy of it, the sense that the decision was no longer something in motion, but something already placed, already anchored in a system that would continue without my constant attention. The diner moved at its own steady pace around me, the quiet exchange of plates, the low murmur of conversation, a rhythm that did not change for any single person, and I appreciated that, because it reminded me that structures that endure are not built on reaction. They are built on consistency, on rules that apply regardless of who is present, and that was exactly the kind of structure I had relied on earlier. One that did not need to explain itself once it was set into motion. I reached for my phone again, not out of urgency, but out of habit, and this time there was a notification waiting, a short message, no excess language, just confirmation that the initial contact had been made, that the lender had acknowledged the flag position and placed a temporary hold on final confirmation, and I read it once, then again, not because it was complicated, but because I understood the significance of what that simple line represented. It meant that the assumption of completion, the expectation that everything was proceeding smoothly, had already been interrupted, not publicly, not dramatically, but at a level where it would begin to surface soon enough. I placed the phone back down and wrapped my hand around the cup again, feeling the remaining warmth, and I allowed myself to consider how the next sequence would likely unfold. The quiet confusion at first, a question raised in a side conversation, a delay that did not align with expectations, followed by a request for clarification, and then the gradual realization that something foundational had shifted, something that could not be resolved with a quick explanation or a polite smile, because it would not be based on perception, it would be based on documentation, on terms that existed independently of anyone's current preferences. I thought about Claire in that moment, not as she had been earlier at the entrance, but as she would be when that first question reached her, when someone asked why the file had been flagged, why the lender was requesting review, and I imagined the brief pause before she answered, the moment where she would need to reconcile the version of events she had been presenting with the underlying reality that had just been activated, and I did not feel satisfaction in that image, only recognition, because consequences are not about punishment, they are about alignment, bringing actions and outcomes back into agreement. The waitress passed by again, refilling a cup for someone a few seats down, and she glanced at me briefly, offering a small, neutral smile, the kind that acknowledges presence without requiring anything more, and I returned it with a slight nod, appreciating the simplicity of the interaction, the absence of expectation, and I realized that what had happened tonight was not just about exclusion. It was about the conditions under which inclusion was granted, the invisible criteria that had been applied without discussion, and how those criteria had overridden prior agreements without acknowledgement. I took another slow sip of the coffee and set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter out of habit, and I let my gaze rest on the reflection in the stainless steel behind the counter, a faint, slightly distorted version of myself, but still recognizable, still consistent, and I considered how easy it would have been to respond differently earlier, to insist, to question, to create a scene that would have forced immediate attention, and I understood why that might have felt justified in the moment, but I also understood why it would have been ineffective, because it would have shifted the focus away from structure and into emotion, and emotion, unlike structure, is easy to dismiss, easy to reinterpret. My phone remained still beside me. No new messages, no additional updates, and that was as it should be, because processes like this do not accelerate simply because someone is watching them. They move according to their own internal logic, each step triggering the next, and I was content to let that logic unfold without interference, because I had already done what was required at the point where my involvement mattered most. Outside, the night had settled into a deeper quiet. The earlier flow of arrivals replaced by the occasional passing car, the distant glow of the event now just another part of the background, and I felt no pull to return to it, no curiosity about what was happening inside, because whatever was unfolding there was already operating on a timeline that had been altered, whether they realized it yet or not. And as I reached for the check and placed a few bills on the counter, leaving enough to cover both the coffee and the small space I had occupied, I stood up with the same steady motion I had used all evening, my posture unchanged, my pace unhurried, and I stepped back out into the night knowing that the most significant part of this evening had not been the moment I was asked to leave, but the moment I chose how to respond, and that response, quiet as it had been, was already beginning to reshape everything that would follow. The night air felt cooler when I stepped out of the diner, not sharply cold, but steady enough to remind me that time had moved forward while everything else had been unfolding beneath the surface, and I adjusted my jacket slightly as I walked back toward the main street, not with any intention of returning to the event, but because that direction still connected to the broader structure of the evening, the place where assumptions were still being made, where people were still operating under the belief that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The glow of the building came back into view as I reached the corner again, softer now from a distance, less imposing, almost ordinary, and I stopped just long enough to observe without being seen, because distance changes perspective, and perspective reveals patterns that proximity often hides. Inside, through the wide glass panels, I could see movement, clusters of guests shifting positions, glasses raised, conversations continuing, and for a moment nothing appeared different, nothing visibly disrupted, which is exactly how these kinds of shifts begin, quietly, beneath the surface, where the structure changes before the appearance does, and I understood that the first signs would not be dramatic, they would be subtle, a pause in a conversation, a glance exchanged between two people who noticed something did not align, a question asked in a tone that suggested it was not the first time it had been considered. I watched as a man in a dark suit stepped slightly away from a group and took out his phone, his expression tightening just a fraction as he read something on the screen. And though I could not hear what was being said, I recognized the pattern, the early stage of disruption, where information begins to circulate in controlled channels before it reaches the broader room. And I saw him lean toward Ryan a moment later, speaking quietly, their heads close together, and Ryan's posture shifted almost immediately, not dramatically, but enough for someone paying attention to notice, a slight straightening of the shoulders, a brief glance toward the entrance, as if checking something that should have been certain. I remained still, my hands resting lightly at my sides, because this was not a moment that required intervention, it required observation, and I followed the interaction as it moved through its natural progression. Ryan listening, nodding once, then responding in a way that suggested confidence, or at least the appearance of it, the kind of response people give when they believe a situation can be managed, contained, resolved without broader impact. And I understood that stage as well, because I had seen it before, the initial assumption that a disruption is temporary, that it can be explained away, that it does not reach the level of consequence. Claire approached them a few seconds later, her expression composed, her movements controlled, and Ryan turned slightly toward her, speaking in a lower tone, and I saw the moment her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the smallest shift around the eyes, the kind that reveals a new piece of information has entered the equation, something unexpected, something that requires recalculation, and she glanced briefly toward the entrance again, the same direction Ryan had looked, the same point where earlier in the evening I had stood, and I understood that the connection had begun to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a line between what had happened outside and what was now unfolding inside. I exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because this was the moment where assumption begins to meet reality, where the structure that had been taken for granted starts to show signs of strain, and I knew that what followed would not be immediate resolution. It would be a sequence of confirmations, calls made, documents reviewed, explanations requested, each step reinforcing the one before it. Until the full scope of the situation became clear, I took one final look at the scene inside, not with satisfaction, not with regret, but with a steady awareness of cause and effect, and I turned away again, stepping back from the corner, allowing the distance to return, because my role in this phase was complete, the process had been initiated, the structure had been engaged, and whatever unfolded next would do so according to the same principles that had guided every decision up to this point. Not emotion, not perception, but alignment. And as I walked away from the glow of the building once more, I understood that the evening had entered its next stage, one that would not be defined by whispers at the door, but by the quiet, unavoidable consequences of what had been set into motion. I kept walking after leaving the corner behind, my pace steady, my direction deliberate, not wandering, not circling back, because once a decision has been made at that level, movement becomes simpler, clearer, and as I moved farther down the street, the sounds of the event faded into something indistinct, replaced by the quieter rhythm of the city settling into its evening. And I let that rhythm guide my steps, not because I needed distraction, but because I understood that the most important part of what had been set in motion no longer required my presence to continue. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated once in my pocket, a single, controlled alert, and I did not rush to check it. I waited until I reached a more evenly lit stretch of sidewalk, then took it out and looked at the screen. Another message, slightly longer this time, still concise, still precise, confirming that the title office had acknowledged the flagged equity position and had placed an internal hold on any final documentation pending clarification of ownership structure. And I read the words carefully, not because they were difficult to understand, but because I recognized the shift they represented. This was no longer just a preliminary signal. This was the beginning of formal disruption, the point where internal systems begin to protect themselves by slowing down processes that no longer meet their requirements. I slipped the phone back into my jacket and continued walking, my expression unchanged, my posture still aligned with the same quiet control I had maintained all evening, because there was nothing in that message that required a reaction, only recognition, and I understood that inside the building, the next stage would already be forming. The first explanation offered, the initial attempt to minimize the issue, to frame it as a minor delay, something procedural, something that could be resolved quickly, and I could almost hear the tone that would be used, calm, confident, designed to reassure rather than alarm. But I also knew that confidence at that stage is often based on incomplete information, on the assumption that the system will bend to accommodate expectation, rather than enforce its own structure. I turned onto another block, one lined with older buildings, their windows reflecting the streetlights in a softer, less polished way, and I allowed my thoughts to settle into a deeper understanding of what was unfolding. Because this was not about a single document or a single transaction. It was about the alignment between representation and reality. And when those two begin to diverge, systems respond in predictable ways. They pause, they verify, they request clarification. And if the clarification does not resolve the discrepancy, they escalate, not emotionally, but procedurally, step by step, each layer reinforcing the need for resolution before continuation. Another vibration came through my pocket, quicker this time, and I took the phone out again, glancing at the screen. A short note indicating that the lender had requested immediate confirmation of the equity contribution source and its conditions, a request that would not have been made under normal circumstances, a request that signaled that the initial hold had already moved into active inquiry, and I nodded slightly as I read it, because that was the expected progression, the natural consequence of the clause being activated. Not aggressive, not punitive, just corrective. I imagine the conversation now, not in detail, but in structure, the lender reaching out, the question framed in neutral terms, the expectation of a clear answer, and the moment when that answer could not be provided in the way it had been assumed, because the underlying agreement did not support the narrative that had been presented, and I understood that this was where the real shift would begin, not at the surface level of the event, but within the framework that supported everything beneath it. I slowed my pace slightly as I approached an intersection, waiting for the light to change, and I looked across the street at the steady flow of traffic, each car moving according to signals, according to rules that applied equally to all, and I found a certain clarity in that, a reminder that systems function best when they are not influenced by individual preference, and that was exactly the principle now in effect. The agreement I had put in place was not reacting to emotion, it was enforcing terms, and those terms did not adjust themselves to fit a new context simply because it was more convenient. The light changed and I crossed, my steps even, my focus forward, and as I reached the other side, I allowed myself one final acknowledgement of what this phase represented, not an ending, not even a resolution, but a transition into a space where outcomes would be determined by alignment rather than assumption. And I understood that whatever responses were happening behind me, whatever conversations were beginning to unfold, They were already operating within a structure that had shifted, a structure that would not return to its previous state without addressing the conditions that had triggered the change. And as I continued walking into the quieter part of the night, I knew that the most significant part of what had been set in motion was not visible yet, but it was already shaping everything that would come next. By the time I reached the next block, the city had settled into a quieter pattern, the kind that reveals itself only after the surface noise fades, and I slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that this was the phase where observation mattered less and confirmation began to take its place. My phone vibrated again, longer this time, not a brief notification but a call, and I took it out without urgency. Glancing at the name before answering, the same voice from earlier. Steady, precise, already aligned with the structure we had set in motion. "We have an update," he said, and I could hear in his tone that the process had moved beyond initial checks into something more defined, more consequential. I remained where I was, near the edge of the sidewalk beneath a streetlight that cast a clean, even glow, and I responded simply, "Go ahead," because there was no need for preamble. No need to frame the situation again. It was already understood. "The lender has escalated the review," he continued. "They are requesting immediate documentation to validate the equity position and its conditions, and without that validation, they cannot proceed with the current loan structure." And I listened without interruption, because this was exactly how it was designed to unfold, each step building on the last. Each request tightening the framework until only aligned information could pass through. "The title office has also placed a temporary restriction on the file," he added. "No closing can occur until the ownership structure is clarified and confirmed." And I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because this was no longer a delay. It was a structural halt, the kind that forces every party involved to stop and reassess their position against the actual terms in place. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting my stance as I looked down the street, the quiet line of parked cars, the distant glow of another intersection, and I asked the only question that mattered at this stage. "Have they responded?" And there was a brief pause before he answered. "They are attempting to," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But the information they are providing does not align with the documented agreement." And that was the point where assumption meets limitation, where what someone believes to be true is tested against what is formally recorded. And I understood that this was where the pressure would begin to move inward, not from me, but from the system itself. I let a second pass before responding, not because I needed to think, but because I was allowing the weight of that confirmation to settle into its proper place. "Continue as outlined," I said, my tone unchanged, because there was no need to adjust the course. It was already correct, already aligned with the original structure, and he acknowledged with a simple, "Understood," before the line went quiet. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my jacket, my hand resting there for a moment as I considered what that exchange represented. Not a confrontation, not a reaction, but the activation of a framework that does not bend under pressure, that does not reinterpret itself to accommodate convenience. And I understood that inside the building, the atmosphere would have shifted, not visibly, not yet, but in the conversations happening just beneath the surface, in the way voices lower slightly, in the way attention shifts from celebration to clarification. I imagined Claire again, standing in that space, her expression composed, her responses measured, but now carrying the added weight of information that did not align with the narrative she had been maintaining. And I knew that at some point, whether directly or indirectly, the connection would become unavoidable, that the question would move from what is happening to why is it happening, and eventually to who is connected to this shift. And I did not need to be present for that realization to occur, because it would arise naturally from the structure now in place. I resumed walking, my steps steady, my direction unchanged, because there was nothing left to initiate, only outcomes to allow. And as I moved through the quiet street, I felt that same calm certainty remain intact, not strengthened by what had just been confirmed, but validated by it, because every step had unfolded exactly as it was designed to, without excess, without deviation. A car passed slowly beside me, its headlights briefly illuminating the path ahead, and I continued forward into that light without breaking stride, because clarity does not require reinforcement, it requires consistency. And I had maintained that from the moment I chose how to respond. And now the system was doing the same, reinforcing alignment through action, ensuring that what had been set in place would carry through to its natural conclusion, regardless of how it was received by those who had not expected it. And as the street stretched out ahead of me, quiet and unremarkable, I understood that the most significant changes rarely announce themselves in dramatic ways. They reveal themselves through shifts in structure, through the quiet but undeniable movement of processes that do not need to be seen to be effective, only allowed to continue. I continued walking until the street opened into a quieter stretch lined with older apartment buildings, the kind with dim porch lights and narrow staircases, and I slowed again, not because I needed to stop, but because I could feel the sequence. Reaching a point where the internal shifts would begin to surface externally, where what had been contained within systems and documents would start to appear in conversations, in expressions, in the small but undeniable signs that something was no longer proceeding as expected. My phone vibrated once more, not a call this time, but a series of notifications arriving close together, and I took it out, glancing down at the screen as I came to a stop beneath another streetlight, the glow steady, neutral, illuminating the details without distortion. The first message confirmed that the lender had formally suspended the loan approval pending full verification of the equity source and its enforceable conditions. The second indicated that the title office had escalated the file to supervisory review due to conflicting claims regarding beneficial interest, and I read both messages carefully, not because I needed clarification, but because I understood the weight of what they represented. This was no longer a quiet adjustment. It was a structural interruption that could not be smoothed over with explanation alone. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and let my gaze lift slightly, focusing on the empty stretch of sidewalk ahead, and I allowed the implications to settle fully into place, because at this stage, the process no longer depended on interpretation, it depended on resolution, and resolution required alignment, something that had already been compromised, I imagined. The shift inside the building now, not in dramatic terms, but in the quiet ways that matter. The moment when the initial reassurances began to lose their effectiveness, when the same question was asked a second time, then a third, each time carrying a slightly different tone, less confident, more precise, and I could see Claire standing there, her posture still composed, her responses measured, but now working against a framework that did not support the version of events she had been relying on, and I knew that at some point, the conversation would move beyond her control, beyond presentation, into verification, where documents speak more clearly than words. A car turned onto the street behind me, its headlights casting a brief shadow ahead of my feet before continuing past, and I remained still for a moment longer, letting the quiet return, because this was the phase where stillness matters, where action has already been taken and further movement only risks interference. I reached into my jacket and touched the envelope again, not to remove it, but to acknowledge its presence, its role in everything that had unfolded. And I thought about the terms written within it, the clarity they had provided at the beginning, and the way they now defined the outcome, not as a reaction, but as a correction. I resumed walking after a few seconds, my steps steady, my direction unchanged, because there was nothing left to initiate, only consequences to allow. And as I moved forward, I felt no urgency to return, no inclination to check again, because I understood that what was happening would not reverse itself simply because it was inconvenient. Systems do not operate on convenience. They operate on alignment, and alignment had already been disrupted. Another vibration came through my pocket, shorter this time, and I checked it briefly. A final confirmation for the evening. The lender had scheduled a direct review call for the following morning, requiring all parties to present verifiable documentation supporting their claims, and I nodded slightly as I read it, because that was the natural progression, the point where everything would be brought into the open, where assumptions would be tested against records, and only what could be supported would remain. I placed the phone back into my pocket and continued walking into the deeper quiet of the night, the sounds of the earlier event now completely absent, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own steps. And I understood that the most significant part of this process would not be visible tonight. It would unfold in the hours and days ahead, through structured conversations, formal reviews, and decisions made within systems that do not bend to personal narrative. As I moved farther away, the city around me returned to its ordinary state, unchanged, unaffected by what had just been set into motion, and I found a certain clarity in that. A reminder that while individual moments can shift direction, the larger structure continues, adjusting where necessary, reinforcing where required. And I allowed myself one final reflection on the evening, not on what had been said or done, but on what had been revealed, because that revelation, quiet as it was, had already begun to reshape everything that would follow, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable alignment of terms with reality. The night had fully settled by the time I reached the end of the block, the city quieter now, the earlier energy replaced by a steady stillness that did not ask for attention, and I slowed my steps once more, not because I needed to stop, but because I understood that this was the point where everything had already been set into its final direction, where no further action from me would change the course that had been established. I stood for a moment beneath the final streetlight, its glow, clean and even, and I let the silence settle completely, not as an absence, but as a confirmation that there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to question, because everything that mattered had already revealed itself in the simplest way possible, through choice. My phone remained still in my pocket. No new calls, no urgent messages, only the quiet understanding that the next developments would unfold without requiring my presence, and I appreciated that, because it meant the structure was functioning exactly as intended, independent, consistent, aligned with the terms that had been put in place long before this evening. I thought about Claire one last time, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of distant clarity, because the moment that mattered most had not been inside that building. It had been at the door, in the space where she had made her decision, where she had chosen how I would be positioned in her life moving forward, and that choice, quiet as it had been, had carried more weight than anything that followed. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope, holding it for a second under the light, its edges sharp, its presence unchanged, and I ran my thumb along the fold I had made earlier, a small crease that marked the moment things had shifted, not dramatically, but definitively, and I understood that what it represented had not been lost, only clarified, its purpose no longer tied to assumption, but to structure. I placed it back into my jacket carefully, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition, because it still belonged to a system that was now fully in motion, a system that would continue to move forward, until everything aligned with what had been agreed upon from the beginning. I took a slow breath and let it out evenly, my posture still straight, my movements still measured, and I turned away from the streetlight, continuing down the sidewalk without looking back, because there was no need to confirm anything further, no need to revisit what had already been decided through action. Behind me, somewhere in the distance, the event continued, conversations shifting, questions forming, answers being tested against reality. But none of that required my presence, because the most important part had already been done, not in that room, but outside of it, in the quiet space where I had been given a clear understanding of where I stood. I walked on, the sound of my steps steady against the pavement, and I understood that dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by others. It is something that is maintained through choice, through the way you respond when something is revealed to you. And tonight, that choice had been made without hesitation, without noise, without the need to prove anything to anyone. As the street stretched out ahead of me, empty and still, I felt no urgency to reach any destination, because the direction itself was already enough, clear, consistent, and entirely my own, and whatever followed from this point forward would not be shaped by what had been denied, but by what had been set into motion, quietly, deliberately, and with a certainty that did not require acknowledgement to be real.